The mess hall of the great warship Resolute was loud and busy that evening. The ship carried soldiers from 12 different alien species, and they all gathered here to eat and rest between their duties. The smell of strange foods filled the air, and the sound of dozens of languages mixed together like music. At one table near the center of the hall sat a group of Belittled soldiers. They were tall creatures with blue skin and 4 arms. Each of them stood nearly 8 feet tall, and they moved with the confidence of warriors who had never known defeat. Their species had been part of the Galactic Coalition for over 1,000 years, and they considered themselves among the finest soldiers in the known universe. Commander Threll was the leader of this group. He had fought in dozens of battles, and his chest was covered with medals and honors. His forearms rested on the table as he looked at a small glowing device that showed information about different species in the Coalition today. He was reading about humans. The humans were new to the Coalition. They had only joined 50 years ago after the first contact wars, when the Coalition had discovered their small planet called Earth. The war had been short. The humans had fought bravely, but their technology was primitive compared to the great fleets of the Coalition. They had surrendered after only 2 years, and since then they had served as minor members of the Alliance. Sethril found the human cultural files very amusing. "Look at this," he said loudly to his companions. His voice carried across the mess hall, and many soldiers from other tables turned to listen. The humans believed in invisible beings who lived in the sky. They called them gods, and they thought these gods controlled everything that happened in their lives. The other Veilous soldiers laughed. Their laughter was a strange clicking sound that came from deep in their throats. "That is ridiculous," said one of them, a soldier named Morn. "How could any species be so foolish?" Threll scrolled through more of the files, and his amusement grew. "It gets better," he said. "Listen to this. The humans believed that when their warriors died in battle, they would go to a magical place in the sky called Valhalla. There they would eat and drink and fight forever. They thought death was not the end but the beginning of an eternal party." The laughter grew louder now. Other alien species at nearby tables joined in. A group of insect-like Crethians clicked their approval. A pair of massive stone-bodied golemites rumbled with what passed for humor in their species. "They actually believed this," Vorn asked. "They did," Thrall confirmed. "They painted pictures of it. They wrote songs about it. They built temples to these imaginary gods and spent their lives praying to beings that never existed." One of the younger Veilous soldiers named Syrah was not laughing as loudly as the others. She had always been more curious than cruel, but even she found it hard to understand how any intelligent species could believe such strange things. Perhaps it helped them deal with fear, she offered. Maybe believing in an afterlife made them less afraid of death. Thrall waved one of his 4 hands dismissively. "That is exactly the problem," he said. "A true warrior does not need fairy tales to face death. A true warrior faces reality with clear eyes." The humans wrapped themselves in comfortable lies instead of accepting the universe as it is. That is why they lost the first contact wars. That is why they will always be inferior. Across the mess hall, sitting alone at a small table near the wall, was a human soldier. His name was David Kim, and he was 34 years old. He had dark hair cut short in military style, and his face was lean and weathered from years of combat. He wore the simple gray uniform of a Coalition support soldier, and on his chest was a small ribbon that most of the aliens in the room did not recognize. David heard every word the Veilith were saying. He had heard words like these many times before. In the 50 years since humanity had joined the Coalition, humans had never been treated as equals. They served as support soldiers, as mechanics, as medics, as cooks. They were given the jobs that other species considered beneath them. They were tolerated but never respected. David did not react to the mockery. His face remained calm and still. He continued to eat his meal slowly and methodically, as if the laughter did not reach his ears. But inside, something old and deep was Stirring other humans in the mess hall shifted uncomfortably. Some stared at their food. Some pretended not to hear. None of them spoke up. They were outnumbered and outranked. Speaking up would only make things worse. At least that was what they told themselves. A young human woman named Lisa Park sat 2 tables away from David. She was a medic, and she had served alongside him for 3 years. She knew him better than most, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, even if no one else could. She wanted to go to him, but she knew he preferred to be alone at times like this. Thoreau was still talking, still entertaining his audience with human foolishness. And, "Look at this," he said, pulling up another file. They believed that the world would end in a great battle called Ragnarok. All their gods would die and everything would be destroyed. But somehow this was supposed to be glorious. Can you imagine such a dark and hopeless mythology? It is no wonder they surrendered so quickly, Vorn added. Their minds were full of fantasy. They had no grasp of real military strategy. Thoreau nodded. They were primitives playing with nuclear weapons. We did them a favor by conquering them. The laughter reached its peak, and David set down his eating utensil. He had lost his appetite. He stood up slowly, his movements calm and controlled. He picked up his tray and began walking toward the exit row. Noticed him and called out loudly, "Oh, look. The human is leaving. Perhaps he is going to pray to his sky gods." Some of the aliens laughed, but others grew quiet. There was something about the way the human moved that made them uneasy. He walked like a predator, not like prey. He walked like someone who had seen death many times and no longer feared it. David paused near the door. He did not turn around. He did not respond to the mockery. He simply stood there for a moment as if considering something. Then, he walked out into the corridor and disappeared. Thrall snorted. "See," he said, "no spine. That is why humans will never be more than support units. They cannot even defend their own honor." Sira watched the door where the human had vanished. Something about him had caught her attention. The ribbon on his chest, the way he carried himself, the complete absence of fear or anger in his eyes. She quietly activated her personal datapad and began searching through Coalition military records. She was curious about this human who had sat so calmly while his entire species was mocked. What she found made her blood run cold. The ribbon on his chest was not just any decoration. It was the Crimson Star, the highest honor the Coalition could give for valor in combat. It had only been awarded 7 times in the entire history of the Coalition, and this human had earned it at a place called Crimson Valley. The file was heavily classified. Most of the details were hidden behind security blocks that Sira could not access. But what little she could read told her that something extraordinary had happened there. Something that the Coalition did not want widely known. She looked up at Thrall, who was still laughing and joking with his companions. He had no idea what kind of soldier he had just insulted. None of them did. But Sira had a feeling they were going to find out. 3 days passed aboard the Resolute and life continued as normal. The ship moved through the darkness of space on its patrol route, and the soldiers trained and rested and waited for orders. The mockery of humans in the mess hall was forgotten. By most, everyone had moved on to other gossip and other amusements. Everyone except Sira, the young Veilless soldier, had spent those 3 days quietly researching. She read everything she could find about humans and their history. She learned about their wars and their heroes. She learned about the strange beliefs that her commander had mocked, and she learned more about the mysterious Battle of Crimson Valley. The more she read, the more confused she became. Humans were supposed to be weak. They were supposed to be primitive and foolish, but their history told a different story. It told of a species that had clawed its way up from nothing. A species that had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that killed millions. They had split the atom and walked on their moon and reached for the stars, all within a few generations. And then there was Crimson Valley. The files were still mostly classified, but Sira had found fragments, pieces of reports and testimonies that painted a picture. She could not fully see 200 human soldiers against 3,000 Dominion warriors. A battle that should have lasted minutes had lasted 19 hours. When it ended, only 31 humans remained alive, and somehow they had won. Sira did not understand how such a thing was possible. The Dominion were the most feared enemy the Coalition had ever faced. They were serpentine creatures bred for combat, with scales harder than steel and claws that could tear through armor. Their hunting packs had destroyed entire battalions of Coalition soldiers. How had 200 humans held them off? She was still thinking about this when the alarm sounded. All officers report to the command deck immediately. The announcement echoed through every corridor of the ship. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Sira ran to the command deck along with dozens of other soldiers. When she arrived, she found Commander Thrall already there, standing at attention before Admiral Vex. Admiral Vex was an ancient being made of living crystal. They had served the Coalition for over 500 years, and their word was law on this ship. Their body glowed with soft blue light as they addressed the assembled officers. We have received a distress signal from Outpost Keth 7, the Admiral said. Their voice was like wind chimes in a storm. The outpost went silent 6 hours ago. We believe a Dominion raiding party is responsible. Murmurs spread through the crowd. The Dominion had been quiet for years. Many had hoped they were finally weakening, but a raiding party meant they were still active, still hunting. Commander Thrall stepped forward. Admiral, I volunteer my squad for the rescue mission. The Admiral regarded him with ancient eyes. Very well, Commander, you will lead the ground team, but you will not go alone. Thrall frowned. Who else will accompany us? You will be joined by human support personnel, the Admiral said, and Sergeant David Kim will serve as your tactical advisor. The name hit Sira like a thunderbolt. She looked around and saw the human soldier standing quietly at the back of the room. He wore the same calm expression she had seen in the mess hall. His crimson star ribbon was barely visible beneath his combat jacket. Rel did not hide his displeasure. With respect, Admiral, I do not need a human advisor. My squad is fully capable of handling this mission alone. The Admiral's crystalline body flickered with something that might have been irritation. Sergeant Kim was specifically requested by High Command. You will utilize his expertise, Commander. That is not a suggestion. Thrall wanted to argue more, but he knew better than to challenge High Command. He gave a stiff nod. Yes, Admiral. David stepped forward and spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet but steady. I will try not to slow you down, Commander. There was no sarcasm in his words, no anger. It was a simple statement of fact, and somehow that made it worse. Thrall would have preferred defiance, something he could respond to with force, but this quiet confidence left him with nothing to attack. The briefing continued for another hour. They reviewed maps and intelligence reports and equipment lists. The outpost on Keth 7 housed 40 Coalition soldiers and researchers. If any of them were still alive, time was running out when the briefing ended. The soldiers hurried to prepare for deployment. Sira found herself walking beside David in the corridor. Sergeant, she said carefully, I read about the Battle of Crimson Valley. David glanced at her. His eyes were dark and deep like wells that went down forever. Did you? File was mostly classified, but I saw enough to know that something extraordinary happened there. She hesitated. Can you tell me what really happened? David was quiet for a long moment. They walked past other soldiers rushing to their stations. The ship hummed with activity around them. Finally, he spoke. We held the line. That was all he said. 3 words that explained nothing and everything. Sira wanted to ask more, but something in his voice told her the conversation was over. The dropship launched an hour later. It was a cramped metal box designed for combat insertion, not comfort. 12 Violet warriors sat in 2 rows, their 4 arms, checking weapons and adjusting armor. 4 human support soldiers sat at the back, including David and Lisa. The medic Sira sat across from David. She studied him when she thought he was not looking. He sat perfectly still while everyone else fidgeted with nervous energy. His eyes were closed, but she did not think he was sleeping. He seemed to be conserving his strength, preparing himself for what was to come. Commander Thrall stood at the front of the dropship, addressing his veilless soldiers. "We do not know how many Dominion are on the surface," he said. "We go in fast and hard. We secure any survivors, and we eliminate any hostiles. Is that clear?" The Veilith responded with a unified shout of agreement. "Turn to look at the humans you will provide support. Stay out of our way, and do not interfere with combat operations." David opened his eyes. "Understood." Commander Thrall held his gaze for a moment, searching for something. He did not find it. He turned back to his soldiers and resumed his briefing. Lisa leaned close to David and whispered, "He really does not like you." David almost smiled. "I have that effect on people." The dropship shuddered as it entered the atmosphere of Keth 7 through the small windows. They could see the moon's surface approaching fast. It was a dead world. Gray rock and black shadows stretched in every direction. Dust storms swirled across the plains, and somewhere down there, the Dominion were waiting. They were 3 minutes from landing when the first missile hit. The explosion tore through the left engine and sent the dropship spinning. The soldiers were thrown against their restraints. Alarms screamed and warning lights flashed red. The pilot fought desperately with the controls, but there was nothing she could do. "Brace for impact," she shouted. David grabbed Lisa and pulled her close, shielding her with his body. The world became chaos. Fire and metal and darkness spinning together. The dropship hit the ground and everything went black. When David opened his eyes, he was lying in wreckage. The dropship had broken apart on impact. He could see the gray sky of Keth 7 through a hole in the hull. Dust was settling around him. He checked himself quickly. Nothing broken. He had been lucky. He crawled toward Lisa and found her unconscious, but breathing. A gash on her forehead was bleeding badly, but she would survive. David pulled himself out of the wreckage and looked around at the nightmare they had landed in. 3 Velith were dead, still strapped in their seats. They had been killed on impact. 2 more were badly wounded. One of the human support soldiers was missing, probably thrown from the ship during the crash. Commander Thrall was alive but dazed. He was pulling himself up on 4 shaky arms, blood running from a cut on his head, and in the shadows of the rocks around them, something was moving. David saw them first. Dominion hunters. 6 of them, at least, maybe more. They were circling the crash site like sharks around the wounded fish. Their scales glittered faintly in the dim light. Their claws scraped against stone. They had been waiting. David realized the ambush had been planned. They had known the rescue mission was coming. This was not just a raid. This was a trap. The first Dominion attack came fast and silent. One moment the survivors were pulling themselves from the wreckage. The next moment a serpentine shadow burst from behind a rock formation and slammed into a wounded Veileth soldier. The soldier screamed, but only for a moment. The Dominion hunter was 8 feet of muscle and scales and razor claws. His jaws closed around the Veileth throat, and the scream became a gurgle. Then silence. Everyone scatter. Thrall roared, but his voice cracked with something none of his soldiers had ever heard before. Fear. The survivors ran. They stumbled over rocks and crashed into each other in their panic. The organized military unit that had boarded the dropship was gone. Now they were just terrified creatures fleeing for their lives. David did not run. He grabbed Lisa and dragged her behind a large boulder. Then he pulled out his rifle and fired 3 precise shots at the Dominion that had killed Veilith. The creature hissed as the bullets sparked off its armored scales. It turned toward David, its yellow eyes gleaming with hunger, but it did not attack. Instead, it slithered back into the shadows and disappeared. David knew what that meant. The Dominion were not trying to kill them all at once. They were hunting, playing with their prey. They would pick off the survivors one by one, stretching out the terror for as long as possible. It was how they always operated. Over here, David shouted to the scattered soldiers, "We need to regroup." Now slowly the survivors made their way to his position. 7 Veilith remained, including Commander Thrall and Sira. 2 humans, including David and Lisa, who was now conscious. but weak from blood loss. The third human support soldier was still missing, probably dead. They huddled behind a cluster of boulders as the shadows around them moved and shifted. The Dominion were out there circling, waiting. Thrall was trying to regain control of the situation. Everyone check weapons, he ordered. Report ammunition levels. The Valith responded, but their voices were shaky. They had trained for combat. They had even fought in small skirmishes before, but nothing had prepared them for this. The Dominion hunted differently than any enemy they had faced. There was no battle line, no clear engagement. No honor, just death coming from the darkness. We need to call for extraction, Thrall said. He activated his communicator, but all that came back was static. They are jamming our signals of. Course they are, David said quietly. He was scanning the terrain with experienced eyes, taking in every rock formation, every shadow, every possible approach. The Dominion do not leave anything to chance. They planned this carefully. Then what do we do? Thrall demanded. His forearms were trembling slightly. We cannot fight what we cannot see. For a moment no one spoke. The wind howled across the barren landscape, carrying dust and the faint scraping sound of claws on stone. The Dominion were getting closer. David finally spoke. We changed the rules. What do you mean? Sira asked. The Dominion are hunting us, David said, because that is what they do. They see us as prey. They expect us to run and hide and die afraid. He paused and met the eyes of each soldier in turn. So we stopped being prey. Thrall laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want us to attack them. That is suicide. Maybe, David agreed, but dying slowly in the dark is worse. At least my way, we die on our feet. He reached down and pulled a long combat knife from his boot. The blade was old and worn, covered in scratches from years of use, but it was sharp, and it was really, I'm going to tell you something about my people, David said. My ancestors lived in a cold, dark land thousands of years ago. They were called Vikings. They sailed across frozen seas to raid and trade and explore. They were warriors from birth to death. The Valith listened despite themselves. There was something in David's voice that commanded attention. The Vikings believed that dying in battle was the greatest honor a warrior could achieve, David continued. They believed that those who fell fighting would be taken to a great hall called Valhalla. There they would feast and drink and fight alongside the gods forever. Thrall snorted. We already know about your primitive beliefs. We discussed them in the mess hall. Remember? David nodded without anger. I remember, but you missed the point, Commander. The Vikings did not believe in Valhalla because they were foolish. They believed because it made them fearless, a warrior who welcomes death, cannot be intimidated. A warrior who sees glory in falling cannot be broken. He stood up and looked toward the shadows where the Dominion waited. The Dominion have conquered dozens of species. He said they have fought warriors from across the galaxy, but they have never fought humans. Not really. They saw our technology and thought they understood us. They saw our quick surrender and thought we were weak. He smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. They do not know what we become when we stop being afraid. Sarah felt something stir in her chest. She did not fully understand what David was saying, but she felt the power of it. The conviction. What are you suggesting? She asked. We hunt them back. David said. We stop running. We stop hiding. We go into the darkness, and we make them afraid of us. That is insane. Thrall said. David shrugged. Yes, but the insane thing is often the last thing your enemy expects. He turned to face the group fully. His eyes moved from face to face, Valith and human. I'm not ordering anyone to follow me, he said. If you want to stay here and wait for death, that is your choice. But I'm going out there. I'm going to find those Dominion hunters, and I'm going to kill every last one of them. He began to move toward the shadow. Wait, everyone turned. Sarah had stepped forward. Her forearms were steady now, and there was a new light in her eyes. If we are going to die, she said, I would rather die fighting one by one. The others stood. A Valith soldier named Korath, who had been shaking with fear, now gripped his weapon with determination. Another Valith named Thesa checked her blade and nodded. Lisa pulled herself up despite her wound and drew her sidearm. Finally, only Thrall remained sitting, the commander. Looked at his soldiers, at the humans, at the dark landscape around them. His pride warred with his fear. His training warred with everything David had said. Then, he thought about what would happen if he stayed behind alone. He stood. "This is still madness," he said, "but I will not let my soldiers face it without me." David nodded. "There is one more thing. When we engage, I want everyone to scream." Thrall asked. "War cries," David explained. The Vikings would charge into battle screaming at the top of their lungs. It terrified their enemies. It also triggered something in their own blood, something old and fierce, something that made them fight harder than any sane creature should. He looked at each of them one final time. "Tonight, we are all Vikings. Tonight, we feast in Valhalla, or we feast on victory. There is no other option." He raised his knife and moved into the darkness. One by one, the others followed. The hunt had begun. The surface of Keth 7 was a maze of stone and shadow. Jagged rocks rose from the ground like broken teeth, and the dim light from the distant sun barely reached the narrow passages between them. It was the perfect hunting ground for the Dominion. They had evolved in darkness. They lived in darkness. They killed in darkness. But now something was different. David led the group through the maze using skills he had learned across decades of combat. He moved without sound, placing each foot carefully on the rocky ground. He communicated with hand signals that the Valith quickly learned to understand. He became part of the shadows himself. The first Dominion never saw him coming. David had spotted the creature crouched on a ledge above a narrow passage. It was waiting for the group to walk beneath it, ready to drop down and strike from above, a classic ambush tactic. But David did not walk beneath it. He circled around, climbing the rocks with silent precision. He approached the Dominion from behind, using the creature's own confidence against it. The hunter was so focused on its prey below that it never sensed the predator behind. David's knife found the gap between the scales at the base of the skull. The Dominion died without making a sound. "One," David whispered. He lowered the body carefully and waved for the others to continue. They moved past the dead hunter, their eyes wide with shock. No one had ever told them that humans could move like that, fight like that, kill like that. David explained in quick whispers. "As they move, the Dominion are pack hunters," he said. "They rely on numbers and fear. Kill one silently, and the others get nervous. They start looking over their shoulders. They lose focus." Thrall was beginning to understand. This human was not simply brave. He was something else entirely. He had turned fear into a weapon, and he was wielding it with terrifying skill. They found the second Dominion near a small cave opening. It was sniffing the air, trying to locate the prey that should have been panicking and running. But the prey was not running. The prey was gone, and that confused it. Sierra took this one. David had positioned her perfectly, and she struck before the creature could react. Her blade was not as precise as his, but it was enough. The Dominion thrashed once and went still. "Too," Sierra said. Her voice was shaking, but there was pride in it. "Too good," David said. "Keep moving." They were learning. The fear that had paralyzed them was transforming into something else, a dark, fierce joy that none of them had felt before. They were not victims anymore. They were hunters. The third Dominion was larger than the others, a pack leader based on the markings on its scales. It was moving through the rocks quickly, sensing that something was wrong. Its pack was not responding to its signals. The prey was not acting like prey. David let this one see him. He stepped down from behind a boulder and stood in plain sight. The Dominion froze, its yellow eyes locked onto him. Its muscles tensed for a killing lunge. "Come on," David said. His voice was calm, almost welcoming. "I am right here." The Dominion charged. It was faster than anything David had ever faced. Scales glittered, and claws reached, and jaws opened wide enough to bite a man in half. But David was not there anymore. He had moved at the last possible moment, sliding to the side as the creature passed. He slashed with his knife, opening a deep wound along its flank. Then he spun and slashed again, catching its hind leg. The Dominion screamed in pain and rage. It turned to face him again, but now it was limping. Blood dripped from its wounds onto the gray rocks. "Are not so frightening," David said, "when you are the one bleeding." The creature lunged again. David dodged again, but this time he was not alone. Threll appeared from the shadows, all four arms, swinging a heavy blade. The weapon caught the Dominion across the back, and it stumbled. Korath attacked from the other side. His blow was clumsy, but it added to this damage. Thesa followed, then Sira, then the others. They surrounded the pack leader and they cut it down together. When it was over, they stood around the fallen creature, breathing hard. Their weapons were wet with alien blood. Their hearts were pounding with something that was not fear. 333 said. He looked at David with new eyes. That was not tactics. That was art. David shook his head. It is survival. My people have been doing this for thousands of years, hunting things bigger and stronger than ourselves, using teamwork and cunning and will to overcome impossible odds. He pointed toward the darkness where more Dominion waited. There are at least 4 more out there. They know we killed their leader. They are afraid now. I can feel it. How can you feel it? Sira asked. Because fear has a smell, David said. And right now they Reykjavite was right. The remaining Dominion had changed their behavior. They were no longer circling confidently. They were retreating, pulling back toward whatever nest they had made, trying to regroup and understand what had gone wrong. David did not give them time to regroup. He led his group in a relentless pursuit, using every trick humanity had ever learned for hunting. They set simple traps in the passages, using the terrain against their prey. They made noise in one direction while attacking from another. They kept the Dominion off balance, never letting them rest, never letting them think. The 4th kill was Thrall alone. He had found a hunter trying to flee, and he had chased it down with a ferocity that surprised even himself. His 4 arms worked in perfect coordination, blade flashing in the dim light. When the creature fell, he stood over it and felt something he had never felt before. Victory, not just military success, but true visceral victory over a worthy enemy. 5, he announced. The 5th kill was Lisa. She was still wounded, still weak, but when a Dominion cornered her, she did not freeze. She did not cry for help. She drew her medical knife, the small blade she used for emergency surgery, and she fought. The Dominion was faster and stronger, but Lisa was a human. And humans had spent millions of years learning to fight things faster and stronger than themselves. She knew where to cut. She knew how to move. She knew that giving up was never an option. When the creature finally fell, she collapsed beside it, exhausted, but alive. 6, she gasped. Only 2 Dominion remained, and they were terrified. The hunters had become the hunted. Their pack was destroyed. Their leader was dead. And these strange small creatures would not stop coming. They tried to run. They almost made it. David tracked them to the entrance of a cave. The last 2 hunters were inside, pressed against the far wall. Their eyes glowed with fear in the darkness. They hissed and snapped, but they did not attack. They were broken. David stood at the cave entrance and looked at them. For a moment, he almost felt pity. They were just creatures doing what their nature demanded. They had not asked to be enemies of humanity. They had simply been born to hunt. But then he remembered the Valith soldier who had died in the first attack. He remembered all the coalition soldiers who had fallen to Dominion claws over the years. He remembered Crimson Valley and the 200 humans who had stood against 3,000 of these monsters. Pity, fated resolve remained. He raised his rifle and finished it when he walked out of the cave. The others were waiting. They looked different now. Their fear was gone, replaced by exhaustion and triumph, and something deeper, a bond forged in blood and darkness. 8, David said. It is dawn. Thrall stepped forward and did something that shocked everyone. He bowed to David, a deep formal bow of respect. From a Valith commander to a human soldier, I was wrong. He said about everything I said about your people, your myths, your beliefs, your worth. I was wrong, David accepted the bow with grace. You were not entirely wrong, he said. We are primitive in many ways. We believe in things we cannot prove. We hope for things that may not exist. Looked up at the gray sky, where stars were beginning to appear. But those beliefs make us strong, Commander. They teach us to face death without flinching. They teach us that how we die matters as much as how we live. They teach us to never ever give up. He wiped his blade clean and sheathed it. Now, let us find those survivors. The mission is not over yet. They moved out together. No longer Valith and human, but warriors. All of them. They found the outpost at dawn. The Coalition facility was built into the side of a mountain, a reinforced bunker designed to withstand orbital bombardment. The main doors had been torn open by Dominion claws, but inside the survivors had retreated to a secondary shelter. They had been hiding there for 3 days, rationing water and waiting for death. When David and his group broke through the barricade, they found 12 soldiers and researchers huddled in the darkness. They were thin and exhausted and terrified, but they were alive. The rescue team, Thrall announced. We have eliminated the Dominion threat. You are safe. Now the survivors stared at him. Then they stared at the blood covering his armor and the weapons of everyone else. They stared at the humans standing alongside the Valith as equals rather than support personnel. They did not understand what had happened, but they did not need to understand. They only needed to follow David organize the evacuation. His experience showed in every decision, every order, every step of the journey back to a secure location where they could signal for pickup. The jamming equipment had been destroyed along with the Dominion, and now their communications worked again. Rescue ships arrived within hours. The journey back to the Resolute was quiet. The survivors slept. The wounded were treated in the medical bay, and the soldiers who had fought in the darkness sat together processing what they had experienced. Sierra kept looking at David. She had so many questions, but she did not know how to ask them. Finally, she gathered her courage and sat down across from him in the medical bay. They were both being treated for minor wounds. Lisa was resting nearby, recovering from her head injury. Sergeant, she said, tell us about Crimson Valley, please. We need to understand. David was quiet for a long moment. His eyes seemed to look through her, seeing something far away, something painful. Thrall sat down beside Sierra. He said nothing, but his presence made the request clear. He wanted to know too. David finally nodded. It was 7 years ago. He began. Dominion had invaded a colony world called New Haven. 30,000 civilians, farmers and families and children. The Coalition sent us to evacuate them. He paused, remembering. There was a valley, the only passage between the colony and the evacuation ships. The Dominion army was coming, 3,000 hunters against 200 human soldiers. We were the only thing standing between them and all those innocent people. 3,000 against 200, Thrall repeated. That is impossible odds. David almost smiled. We knew that every single one of us knew we were going to die. High Command told us to retreat. They said the civilians were already lost. They ordered us to fall back and save ourselves. He shook his head. We did not listen. Sierra leaned forward. Why not? Because we remembered who we were. David said, we remembered the stories our ancestors told, stories of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off a Persian army. Stories of the Alamo, where a handful of soldiers stood against thousands. Stories of every time in human history when the few stood against the many and refused to break. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had killed so many. We held that valley for 19 hours. We fought until our ammunition ran out. Then we fought with knives and rocks and bare hands. The Dominion kept coming, and we kept killing them. Every time one of us fell, the others fought harder. We did not retreat. We did not surrender. We made them pay for every inch of ground in blood. His voice grew heavy with memory. When reinforcements finally arrived, 31 of us were still standing. 31 out of 200. But the civilians, had escaped. Every single one of them made it to the evacuation ships. Thrall was stunned. How, he asked, how did you endure such losses and keep fighting? David met his eyes. Because we believed that our deaths mattered. We believed that standing against evil was worth any price. We believed that our ancestors were watching and that they would welcome us in Valhalla if we fell with honor. He gestured at the ribbon on his chest. They gave me this medal, but it should have gone to everyone who stood in that valley, the ones who lived and the ones who died. We all made the same choice. We all faced the same darkness, and we all refused to look away. Silence filled the medical bay. The other patients had stopped talking. Nurses had paused in their work. Everyone was listening. I understand now, Sarah said softly. Your myths are not weaknesses. They are sources of strength. They give you something to hold on to when everything else is lost. More than that, David said. They connect us to everyone who came before, everyone who faced impossible odds and kept fighting anyway. When I stood in that valley, I was not alone. I had 10,000 years of human warriors standing with me. Their courage was my courage. Their strength was my strength. He stood up slowly, his wounds protesting the movement. That is what you were mocking in the mess hall, Commander. That unbroken chain of courage stretching back to the beginning of our species. You called it primitive. You called it foolish, but it is the most powerful weapon humanity has ever created. Thrall rose to his feet. He extended all four of his hands in the most formal gesture of respect. His species knew I was a fool, he said. I saw only the surface of your culture, and I judged it without understanding. Sergeant Kim, I apologize. Not just to you, but to your entire species. David clasped the offered hands. I accept your apology, Commander. But I do not want your respect for me alone. I want it for all humans. The ones on this ship and the ones back on Earth. The ones who work in your kitchens and clean your ships and serve in your support units. They all carry the same strength I do. They just have not had the chance to show it. Thrall nodded slowly. You are right. From this day forward I will see humans differently. I will make sure my soldiers do the same. That is all I ask, David said. The days that followed were busy. Reports had to be filed and debriefings conducted and wounded soldiers healed. But something had changed aboard the Resolute. Everyone could feel it. The story of what happened on Keth 7 spread quickly. Veileth soldiers told their friends, who told their friends. The tale grew with each telling, but the core remained true. A human soldier had led a group of survivors against impossible odds and won. More importantly, he had taught them something. Other species began to look at the human crew members differently. The cooks and mechanics and medics who had always been ignored were now seen as potential warriors. Every human carried that same ancient strength, whether they had been tested or not. Lisa was promoted to full combat medic. Her actions in the battle had proven she was more than capable of serving on the front lines. She accepted the promotion with quiet pride. Knowing she had earned it, Sarah requested a transfer. She wanted to study human military history to understand more about the species she had so badly underestimated. Her request was approved, and she spent the next year learning everything she could about Earth wars and warriors. And David continued to serve as he always had, quietly and competently, without seeking glory or recognition. He was offered promotions and honors, and he turned most of them down. He did not fight for medals. He fought because it was right. But sometimes, late at night when the ship was quiet, he would sit alone and remember the friends he had lost at Crimson Valley. He would speak their names softly, as if they could hear him, and he would promise them that their sacrifice had not been forgotten. The old belief said that warriors who died in battle would feast in Valhalla forever. David did not know if that was true. No one did. But he believed that those 200 soldiers were somewhere good. Somewhere. Their courage was honored, and their pain was ended. And that belief gave him the strength to keep going. The universe was vast and dark and full of dangers. But humanity had been facing darkness since the first. Human looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. They had learned to survive, They had learned to fight. They had learned that together they could overcome anything. Was the truth the aliens had not understood? Human myths were not fantasies. They were distilled wisdom. The accumulated knowledge of 1,000 generations about what it meant to be brave, what it meant to sacrifice, what it meant to stand for something greater than yourself. And now the coalition was beginning to understand. David stood at a viewport watching. The stars streamed past as the Resolute traveled through space. Sierra approached and stood beside him. "Where do you think they are now?" she asked. "The ones who fell at Crimson Valley." David was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. "Somewhere warm," he said. "Somewhere. With good food and good company, telling stories about the battle, and waiting for the rest of us to join them." Sierra looked at him. "You really believe that?" David shrugged. "I choose to believe it, and sometimes that is enough." She nodded slowly. "I think I'm beginning to understand why your species has survived so long." David turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "We survived because we refused to let go of hope," he said. "We survived because we told stories that made us brave. We survived because every generation passed down the fire to the next." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "And now we will survive with you. As equals, as allies, as friends." Sierra placed one of her 4 hands over his friend's. She agreed. They stood together watching the stars. Somewhere in the vastness of space, the spirits of fallen warriors were watching, and they were proud.